I'm 48 now, the age my mother used to call too old for drama. And yet most nights, when the house is quiet and the dishwasher hums, my brain still reruns a scene from when I was 18. Me in a blue dress, sitting in a cafe that smelled like burnt coffee and vanilla syrup, waiting for a boy who never came. On paper, my life turned out fine. I teach literature at a community college. I own a small house with creaky floors and too many bookshelves. I have a grown daughter who texts me memes at midnight and a cat who hates everyone but me. I know how to change a tire, negotiate a raise, and act like I'm not bothered when people cancel plans. But underneath all that competence, there's the stupid, stubborn thread that traces back to that night. His name was Daniel. He was the first boy who ever listened to me like my thoughts were something rare and fragile. He asked me out, picked the time and place, promised he'd be there. He wasn't. I told everyone I shrugged it off. I pretended I believed the story my friends fed me, that he was just another cowardly teenage boy. But the truth is, a part of me folded up around that empty chair and never really unfolded again. I thought that was the end of it, just a small, private humiliation I'd eventually outgrow. Then, 30 years later, someone found my photo in an old safe. Back then, everything in my world felt like it was about to start. I just graduated high school. I'd been accepted to a university 2 hours away, and the town I grew up in suddenly felt small enough to hold in my palm. Daniel appeared right in the middle of that restless, buzzing summer. He worked at the hardware store with my brother, tall and quiet with paint-stained fingers and this habit of really listening when people spoke, like he was memorizing them. We met at a barbecue behind the church. I made some sarcastic comment about the pastor's ancient grill, and he laughed. Not the polite kind, but the startled, delighted kind that makes you want to keep talking just to hear it again. We spent the whole evening leaning against the fence, trading stories about teachers we hated and books we loved. When I mentioned I was leaving for college, something flickered in his eyes. Fear, maybe, or urgency. 2 days later, he showed up at the diner where I worked, hair still damp from a shower, nerves written all over him. He ordered a milkshake he barely touched and finally blurted, "Would you go out with me? Before you leave?" I said yes so fast the word felt like a stumble. We picked Saturday, 7 p.m., Cornerstone Cafe. He said, "I'll be there. Promise." I believed him. The night of the date, I showed up 15 minutes early because I didn't want to look overeager, which of course made me look exactly that. I kept smoothing my dress, checking my reflection in the window, watching headlights flare across the parking lot. Every time the door chimed, my heart jumped, and every time it wasn't him, I felt that jump land a little lower, a little heavier. By 7:10, my smile was starting to ache. By 7:25, the waitress, an older woman with kind eyes, asked if I was waiting for someone. I said no, which made her frown in that way people do when they see a truth you're trying to hide. At 7:45, I stood up. I told myself it was fine, that something must have come up. A flat tire, a family emergency, anything but the obvious. I walked home, shoes in hand, humming loudly to drown out the thud in my chest. The next day at work, my brother mentioned casually that Daniel had quit the hardware store without explanation. Just vanished. No one had seen him since Friday. Rumors bloomed instantly. Some said he'd run away. Others said he'd gotten into trouble with the wrong people. A few insisted he'd been seen hitchhiking on the interstate. But no one asked about me. No one realized that I had been left behind in a different way, quietly, inexplicably, and without a single word. It shaped me more than I admitted. I stopped trusting promises, especially the gentle, sincere kind. Time moved on because it always does, even when some part of you stays stubbornly stuck. I went to college, made friends, learned to pretend I wasn't always waiting for the other shoe to drop. I dated men who were predictable, men who showed up 5 minutes early and texted goodnight without fail. Safe men. But whenever things got too close, too tender, I felt this old panic rise. An echo of sitting in that cafe with my hands folded neatly in my lap, pretending everything was fine. I told myself Daniel didn't matter anymore, that he was just a teenage misstep, an embarrassing story I'd someday laugh about. And yet, every few years, something, An old song, a diner booth, the smell of citronella from a summer barbecue would yank me straight back to that night. I'd wonder where he'd gone, why he'd disappeared, whether I'd misread everything or whether he'd been running from something far bigger than me. Life built itself around that unanswered question. I married at 27, divorced at 34, raised a daughter who inherited my habit of overthinking everything. I became the reliable friend, the dependable coworker, the person who didn't ask for more than people were willing to give. But regret has a way of fermenting over decades, turning into something heavier. I never admitted it out loud, but a small, stubborn part of me still wanted to know why he never showed up, and why he had to vanish completely to do it. The past didn't come back with drama. It arrived in an email with the subject line estate inquiry, urgent, which I almost deleted because it sounded like a scam. The sender was a law office 3 states away. I skimmed the message twice before the words actually made sense. They were handling the belongings of a recently deceased man, and my name had appeared in his personal effects. They asked if I could come in or at least confirm my identity. I stared at the screen for a long time, a strange pressure building behind my ribs. I hadn't lost anyone recently, not anyone connected to me, anyway. I almost replied wrong person just to make the discomfort go away. But then I noticed the name at the bottom of the message. The attorney Marlowe and Finch, representing the estate of Daniel Avery. My first thought was that it had to be a coincidence. Daniel was a common enough name, Avery not rare. But my hands had already gone cold. I reread the email again and again until the words stopped blurring. That night, I sat at the kitchen table long after the lights were off, listening to the refrigerator hum while my daughter slept upstairs. 30 years of distance collapsed in an instant. Why would my name be in his belongings? How did he even remember me? By morning, I'd booked a flight without fully deciding to. It felt like muscle memory, like some part of me had been waiting 3 decades for something, anything, that might explain the silence he left me with. The law office smelled like old carpet and lemon polish, the kind of place where secrets felt out of place but somehow inevitable. I sat in a small conference room with a window that looked out on a parking garage, my hands clasped too tightly in my lap. When the attorney, Finch, a man with gentle eyebrows and a funeral director voice, entered, he carried a metal box the size of a shoebox. It was dented, the paint chipped, clearly old. "Thank you for coming, Ms. Rowe," he said. "What we found. Well, it seemed appropriate to return it to you personally." He slid the box toward me. My pulse thudded in my throat. "This belonged to Mr. Avery," Finch continued. "It was discovered in a safe he kept in his workshop. Your name was written on an envelope inside. We haven't opened it." I stared at the box like it might detonate. Hearing Daniel's name spoken aloud, his full name, not the boyish version I'd kept in my memory, hit something in me I didn't know was still raw. My fingers trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside was a single manila envelope, sealed and brittle with age. And clipped to the front, held in place with a rusted paperclip, was a photograph. A photograph of me, 18 years old, blue dress, standing outside Cornerstone Cafe. The air left my lungs in a single, sharp exhale. For 30 years, I'd believed he'd forgotten me, but he'd kept my picture locked away, hidden like something precious or something painful. I don't remember standing up, but suddenly I was near the window, the photograph clutched in my hand like it might explain itself if I held it tightly enough. Finch waited quietly, giving me space I didn't know how to use. My voice finally worked, thin and shaky. Did Daniel ever mention me? At all? Finch folded his hands. "I can only share what pertains to the items found. But I can tell you this much. Your name appeared more than once in his personal notes. I believe he intended to contact you at some point." That hit harder than the photograph. Intended. Past tense. "What happened to him?" I asked. "How did he—" I couldn't finish the question. Finch's expression softened. "He passed from complications related to a chronic condition. One he seems to have lived with most of his adult life. There are medical papers in the safe as well, though they weren't addressed to you." My stomach twisted. A condition? something he'd been dealing with even when we were young. I pressed the envelope between my palms, trying to ground myself. Why me? Why keep this? Finch hesitated, not evasive, more like he was weighing how much to say. Sometimes people hold on to unfinished moments, he said quietly. Things they meant to fix but didn't know how. His words sat heavy in my chest. Unfinished. That was exactly what Daniel and I had been. A sentence he never got to end, and I never got to read. MS. Row, Finch added gently. Whatever is in that envelope, it's meant for you alone. I sat back down because my knees were starting to wobble. The envelope felt absurdly light, like it couldn't possibly hold anything big enough to justify 30 years of silence. Still, my hands shook as I slid a finger under the seal. Inside, there were 2 items: a folded letter and a small, worn index card. I opened the letter first. Claire, it began. My name written in handwriting I barely remembered but instantly recognized. Careful, slanted, the way he used to write notes during class for my brother to pass to me. I owe you a truth I was too afraid to give when it mattered. I didn't stand you up. I didn't run away. That night, I was in the hospital. I collapsed at work 2 hours before our date. They told me I had a heart condition I'd been ignoring for months. I told myself I would explain everything as soon as I could. But when I finally got home and heard the rumors, that you looked embarrassed, that people were talking, I panicked. I didn't want to be a burden, so I stayed away. It was the worst mistake I ever made. My heartbeat thudded violently in my ears. Hospital, heart condition. All those years I'd pictured him deliberately walking away, choosing not to show up. None of that had been true. I unfolded the index card with trembling fingers. On it was a date, July 14th, 1993, and beneath it, in small, shaky handwriting, the day I meant to tell her everything. My breath caught. July 14th, the day he disappeared. The room felt too small, the air too thin. I kept rereading the letter, as if repetition might make the words less devastating. For 30 years, I'd carried around a story that he chose not to show up, that I wasn't worth showing up for. That simple narrative had woven itself into everything. The people I trusted, the ones I didn't, the way I measured my own value. And now, with a few inked sentences on yellowed paper, that entire architecture of belief collapsed inward. He hadn't abandoned me. He'd been sick, scared, alone. And instead of reaching out, he'd retreated into silence that echoed for decades. The strangest part was how the grief felt new and old at the same time. I grieved the boy he was, the man he became, the life he lived without me, and the version of myself who had spent years hardening around a wound that wasn't what I thought. Worse, I felt guilty. Guilty for being angry at him for so long. Guilty for telling myself stories about him that were never his to tell. I folded the letter carefully, hands trembling. Finch watched me with the quiet patience of someone who had seen this kind of unraveling before. "This changes everything," I whispered. But the truth was even heavier than that. It didn't just change the past, it rewrote the person I had become because of it. That night, back in my hotel room, the letter lay on the bedspread like something alive, something breathing softly, waiting for me to pick it up again. I kept pacing, unable to sit still, torn between anger and heartbreak. Part of me wanted to forgive him instantly, to cradle that younger version of him who'd been terrified and sick. But another part, older, sharper, rose up with 30 years of stored resentment. "Why didn't you try again?" I said aloud to the empty room. "Why didn't you write? Call? Anything?" I imagined him in that hospital bed, pale and scared. Then I imagined myself at 18, sitting in that café, humiliated and confused. 2 kids on opposite sides of a misunderstanding that swallowed 3 decades of our lives. A wave of anger surged, at him for staying silent, at myself for never seeking answers, at time for moving so relentlessly without giving either of us a second chance. I grabbed the letter and pressed it to my forehead, as if I could transfer the confusion somewhere outside my body. Eventually I sank to the carpet, knees hugged to my chest. I whispered, "What am I supposed to do with this now?" There was no answer, just the hum of the air conditioner and the ache of a truth that had arrived too late to repair anything. too early to let me walk away unchanged. The next morning, Finch called and asked if I wanted to meet someone connected to Daniel. "Only if you're up for it," he added gently. I almost said no. I was exhausted, wrung out, afraid of whatever new truth might be waiting. But something in me nudged forward, the part that refused to leave loose threads anymore. He introduced me to a woman in her late 60s with silver-streaked hair pulled into a loose braid. "I'm Margaret Avery," she said, voice soft but steady. "Daniel's mother." My breath snagged. I hadn't expected family, let alone someone who looked at me with recognition I didn't understand. We sat in a small office, a box of tissues between us like an unspoken invitation. Margaret folded her hands in her lap. "Daniel talked about you," she said. "More than you'd think for someone he claimed he barely knew." A sad smile touched her lips. "He was always like that, careful on the outside, full of storms underneath." I swallowed hard. Why didn't he ever reach out? Her eyes softened with a grief that looked worn, familiar. Because after his diagnosis, he convinced himself he wasn't allowed to want things, especially not someone he cared about. He thought disappearing would spare people pain. My chest tightened. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. Another letter. "He wrote this a month before he died. It's addressed to you. He just never sent it." My hands shook as I took it. Another unfinished moment. Another truth he never found the courage to give. I unfolded the second letter with a kind of reverence, afraid it might crumble in my hands. The handwriting was shakier, more uneven than the first. Age, illness, life had carved itself into the loops and lines. "Claire," it began again. "I don't know if this will ever reach you. I've carried your name for so long that it feels like part of my own. I still think about that night. How you waited for me, how you must have looked at the door every time it opened. I've imagined it 1,000 different ways, none of them kind. I'm sorry, truly. I thought I was protecting you from a future I wasn't sure I'd be alive to share. But the truth is, I was protecting myself from seeing the disappointment on your face." I stopped reading as my vision blurred. The words felt heavier than any apology I'd heard in my life. "If you ever wonder whether you mattered," the letter continued, "you did. More than you should have. More than I ever deserved. I should have shown up. I should have tried. I hope someday you'll forgive the boy I was. He was scared. But he loved you in the only way he understood love at that age. Quietly, hopelessly, and too late." When I reached the final line, "I wish I had been braver," something inside me cracked open. Not anger, not relief, grief. The raw, keening kind that rises from the deepest parts of a life unlived. "It looks like you intended to request part 13 next, but you wrote only next." Before I continue, I left the law office with both letters tucked inside my bag, held carefully like something fragile enough to tear but strong enough to rearrange my entire understanding of the past. Outside, the air felt sharper, cooler, as if the world had shifted half a degree while I'd been inside learning the truth. I sat on a bench beneath a struggling maple tree and let myself breathe, really breathe, for the first time since opening that metal box. Forgiveness wasn't immediate. It didn't sweep through me like some cinematic epiphany. Instead, it arrived as a small, steady loosening inside my chest, a softening of a knot I'd carried since I was 18. I realized I didn't want to keep punishing a ghost, especially one who had spent his own life regretting the moment he disappeared from mine. So I made a decision, not to forget, because forgetting would erase the boy who had scribbled my name into 2 unsent letters. And not to cling to the grief either, but to let the truth land where it needed to, and to let myself finally step out from the shadow of a misunderstanding that had shaped too many choices. Before heading to the airport, I walked to a small stationery shop and bought a simple notebook. On the first page, I wrote, "This is where the unfinished things end." It wasn't closure exactly, but it was a beginning I chose. Back home, life didn't explode into transformation the way stories sometimes pretend it does. My daughter still left empty yogurt cups in the sink. My cat still yowled dramatically for breakfast. My students still turned in essays that made me question the future of literacy. But something in me had shifted quietly, but unmistakably. For the first time in years, I stopped replaying that night at the cafe like a bruise I couldn't stop pressing. I stopped interpreting every canceled plan as proof I was forgettable. I stopped choosing the safest possible version of relationships, the ones where I never risked wanting too much. I even started seeing someone, a colleague in the history department who laughed too loudly and always smelled faintly of cedar. In the past, I would have kept him at arm's length, waiting for the moment he'd disappear. Instead, I let him in slowly, deliberately, without demanding guarantees he couldn't give. I also wrote a letter to Daniel's mother. Not with questions, those had been answered, but with gratitude. For her honesty. For raising a boy who had loved me in his own flawed, frightened way. For giving me a piece of the story I didn't know I needed. Every so often, I take out the 2 letters and read them again. Not to reopen old wounds, but to remind myself how easily a life can warp around a moment misunderstood. And how deeply truth, even late, can steady a person. In the weeks that followed, I kept thinking about how a single missing conversation had shaped decades of my life. How one boy's fear had hardened into my certainty. How silence can masquerade as rejection when you're young and unsteady. And how the stories we tell ourselves about our own worth can calcify if no one interrupts them. I don't romanticize what happened. Daniel and I were barely more than kids, both inexperienced, both carrying burdens we didn't know how to share. But learning the truth didn't just rewrite that night. It rewrote the way I understood myself. It reminded me that not every unanswered moment is an indictment. Sometimes it's simply unfinished. If there's a lesson in all this, it's that time doesn't heal by erasing. It heals by revealing. Eventually, the things we bury have a way of surfacing. In conversations we didn't expect, in safes we didn't know existed, in old photographs clipped to envelopes meant for us. I used to think closure came from tying things neatly together. Now I understand it's more like opening a window in a room you've kept shut for years. Letting in air, light, perspective. I'm not the girl who waited in the cafe anymore. I'm not the woman who assumed she wasn't worth showing up for. I am someone who knows that sometimes love is clumsy, cowardly, unfinished, and still real. And that truth, finally, is enough to let me move forward with softness instead of fear.